Both Ukraine and its Western partners are in a bit of a sticky situation, but it seems like they are moving in the direction where they will soon implement a solution. Yes, in the midst of a 9-day saga featuring drones over Poland, then drones over Poland and Romania, then MiG-31s inside of Estonian airspace, a proposal came forth to impose a no-fly zone over the skies of Western Ukraine. In theory, such a no-fly zone would end any further incursions along a large section of NATO's eastern flank. In practice, though, successfully implementing it, like most other things worthwhile in geopolitics, is complicated. So, today, we will begin with a brief explanation of the upshot for Poland if Allied countries impose a no-fly zone. Then we will examine why, in contrast to similar calls at the beginning of the invasion, that a no-fly zone is now plausible. After that comes an array of potential issues. The cost of implementing such a program, why a no-fly zone does not have as much upside to Ukraine as it might seem, and the danger of stationing forces inside of Ukraine. Then we will discuss a simple way to mitigate all of those problems. Finally, we will conclude by asking what the likelihood is of this happening. But let's begin by explaining the upshot for Poland, and others, of imposing a no-fly zone. The obvious answer is that these Russian planes, or drones, will not cross the border. But there are a couple of points of nuance worth discussing here further. The first is Zazov. It is not only a friendly reminder that a long-term conflict involving Poland will strain the English-speaking world's ability to correctly pronounce place names, but it is also where coalition partners fly their materiel to ultimately forward to Ukraine. I know that there has been a lot of speculation about Russia's underlying motives for the original drone incursion, but sometimes it is best to just stick to the obvious, at least as a starting point. Poland is arguably Ukraine's most valuable partner, in part because of its enormous defense expenditures, but even more so due to sheer European geography. The only other ways into the country are Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Slovakia and Hungary might not be the most reliable of choices, and Romania was the subject of another drone incursion. Point is that if the Kremlin can coerce Poland to stop providing that lifeline, Ukraine's situation becomes all the more difficult. Plus, there is always the possibility that Russia could actually strike the area to enfeeble the delivery caravans, even if it would prompt an Article 5 situation. The other point is about economic disruption. When drones cross the border, air raid sirens go off, and the country shuts down. As a one-time event, it might give your average Polish citizen a memorable "where were you when that happened" kind of moment. But make it a repeated affair, and suddenly the economic damage to the country starts to add up. Moreover, given how Poland is NATO's leader in military production as a percentage of GDP, Russia would really like to shrink the pie that Warsaw draws from. All of that appears to be shifting Poland's thinking about the Ukraine situation. Not long ago, Warsaw was skeptical of the idea of sending its own troops into Ukraine. After all, Poland has its own border with Belarus to defend, never mind a full-fledged border with Russia because of Kaliningrad. Better to have troops from further west take charge in Ukraine, while Poland stays back to defend its own section of the eastern flank. But that thought process might be changing. Speaking of changes, let's discuss how a no-fly zone is now plausible, whereas the idea was absurd at the beginning of the war. And if you want to go on a journey through time, you could watch this video from 1 month into the invasion when I first covered no-fly zones, which, no one watched at the time. Anyway, back then, public opinion polls in the United States were highly supportive of implementing a no-fly zone. 74% were all in. Kind of crazy to think that that was where the American public once stood in its support for Ukraine. The problem is that respondents to those polls did not understand what a no-fly zone actually does. At the same time as 74% of Americans want it to go, only 7% of international relations scholars supported it. The thing is, no-fly zones are not passive operations, where you peacefully patrol the skies and tell lost Russians to turn their planes around. No, it begins with active operations to destroy ground-based air defenses, to ensure that your aircraft can patrol the skies in relative safety. And then, if a Russian plane challenges the no-fly zone, you actually have to shoot it down. In other words, you need to be willing to pull the trigger when push comes to shove. Otherwise, a no-fly zone is one big, expensive, and meaningless bluff. But that would mean killing Russian airmen, which effectively leaves you at war with Russia. That is how World War III starts, and it is why the United States opted against the strategy despite strong public support. As a broader strategic rule here, the way to win coercive games like this one is to force your opponent to be the one to pull the trigger that starts World War III. At that point, they need to back down on the escalation ladder, allowing you to claim victory in the particular battle. Interestingly, developments over the 3+ years of war have created the conditions where a no-fly zone does not put the West on the precipice. There was an expectation at the beginning of the war that Russian combined arms maneuvers would bury Ukraine. In particular, Russia would own the skies, bomb everything of relevance in the country, and dispatch its ground forces for cleanup duty. But Ukraine's air defenses held. That is why the war evolved into the trench and drone slugfest that it remains today. Instead, the main role for Russia's manned aircraft has been much smaller over the last few years. They tend to fly high in the air over safe territory and drop glide bombs. Basically, they are glorified bomb boosters. The air war has since become synonymous with the drone war, which is more about raw destruction than pinpointing targets that could advance the front. And perhaps you can see where this is going in connection with the earlier problem with establishing a no-fly zone. In the air, the mission would no longer be about killing Russian pilots. It would be about downing drones. And if you are restricting attention to the western section of the country, it is difficult for Russia to point its anti-aircraft systems that far. Well, except for what may be in Belarus. Wonder how he would feel about that. Oh, and there's also Transnistria. Sometimes reality gets complicated. Anyway, if patrol fighters stay within the border region, it would be hard for Russia to mistake them for attack aircraft, which would otherwise increase the risk of a misunderstanding. Consequently, there is no need to destroy Russian anti-aircraft installations at the start of the no-fly zone. A no-fly zone will no longer imply World War III. Unfortunately, the shifting dynamics in the air do not mean that a no-fly zone will automatically work. Let's start with the cost problem, because that is well understood and will therefore be fast. Look, if it costs you more to destroy drones than it costs your opponent to make them, it does not matter if you are shooting down drones on the western side or the eastern side of the border between Ukraine and Poland. You are still fighting a losing battle. Well, maybe it does matter if you place your defenses on the eastern side. Then there will be more drones to shoot down, so the effects of the unfavorable cost ratio look even worse. We will revisit this later, but a no-fly zone needs to be your plan B. It is fine to fire a $1 million Patriot missile in an emergency. It is fine to fly F-16s for tens of thousands of dollars an hour to chase down a handful of drones. But neither of those can be your primary method of defense. Then there is the issue that a no-fly zone will not be as valuable to Ukraine as much of the online chatter suggests. The reason why this logic is tempting is because Ukraine will benefit from a no-fly zone. The question here is the extent of the help. Ukraine has all sorts of defenses scattered throughout the country. If a coalition of willing countries, which my phone has auto-corrected to coalition of the William countries, gotta say I love that, take over Western airspace duties, it would thereby allow Ukraine to shift its own defenses eastward. If you are Ukraine, there is a lot to like here. More defenses specifically around Kyiv is a good thing. If the western sector is especially well protected, then Ukraine can indeed move some of its defensive production there. Also a good thing. I have even heard suggestions that Ukraine will find itself with such an excess of manpower that it can flood more soldiers to the front lines, causing these territorial exchange figures to reverse. Okay, but let's shift our expectations back to reality. We already know that Ukraine's current defenses are insufficient to handle the quantity of Russian drone operations. Let's imagine that Poland and others indeed erect an impenetrable shield around the western section, to the point that Russia no longer bothers firing there. Well, that does not actually solve Ukraine's problem. Russia still has a large supply of drones, and now it can concentrate them on the remainder of the country. Again, Ukraine does not have enough equipment to handle that quantity of drones, and concentrating its own air defenses will not solve that problem. Now, the problem will get better. There are benefits to centralization, but it is not a cure-all. Still, another reason we can be confident that the situation will improve is with a little bit of game theory black magic. Indulge me for a moment. We know that given the current distribution of defenses, Russia believes that it is optimal to disperse its drone attacks broadly. Consequently, it must not be better for Russia to just point everything at central and eastern Ukraine, otherwise it would. Okay, but then the Western Shield enters, and Russia is forced to shift its targeting eastward, where, by the way, Ukraine now has more air defenses. So, yes, that works out better for Ukraine. But still, I would not expect the people of Kyiv to sleep easy at night. Regarding defense industrial production, yes, the western section of Ukraine would look like a more attractive location. The reason that there is not an enormous value added there, though, is that Ukraine already has well-protected defense production sites. And by that, I mean the rest of NATO. A no-fly zone may reduce risk in western Ukraine, but there is close to no risk everywhere else. And that is why Ukraine already partners with NATO countries to produce off-site, and then ship through that hub city with a tough-to-pronounce name. Like the air defense issue, there will be some benefits to investing in the protected zone. There are a lot of Ukrainians who might want to work in defense manufacturing, but do not want to leave the country. A safe western sector gives them the right outlet. It just will not massively shift things in favor of Ukraine. As for the point about manpower, this one is woefully misguided. Ukraine does not have a huge number of well-qualified reserves sitting in the west that could instead be dropped on the front lines to great effect. The way defense forces like this work is that you leave your somewhat capable soldiers behind. These will often be, say, the oldest cohort still capable of contributing. The idea is that, in the unlikely event that a Russian attack occurs from an unexpected direction, they can hold the fort for long enough for your more capable soldiers to arrive. So if the western edge of the country becomes a safe haven, there will be a shift eastward in the availability of forces, and then the somewhat more capable soldiers previously stationed in the center can start moving even further east. But this is the type of thing that moves the balance of forces only at the margins. Now, in the past, I have argued why this is a selling point for Europe, and I stand by that. From Ukraine and Europe's perspective, this is better than this. But we should not expect that some reinforcements will suddenly bring things to here. Never mind give Ukraine the ability to sustain a major offensive and start making gains. And understanding the extent of the benefits is important, because Europe has limited resources, and any political capital exerted on this initiative is political capital that could have gone to the next initiative instead. Ukraine's limitation here is that it is outgunned. It nonetheless manages to get by because being on the offensive requires more manpower than playing the role of defender. Some more Ukrainians will therefore be helpful on the defensive, but it would take a ton more to have the force ratio to go on a proper offensive, at least along the current lines. You never know when Ukraine will get adventurous. The third problem arises if the shield is not as impenetrable as we previously assumed. And that is a heroic assumption that seems to be overlooked in this broader conversation. Ukraine is the world leader in drone defenses, not Poland, not anyone else in Europe, and not the United States. Coincidentally, Ukraine is teaching those skills to NATO countries at the Joint Analysis, Training, and Education Center in Poland. Sure would be nice if I could talk to some of the folks from JTech soon. Anyway, NATO countries lack specific units tasked with taking out drones, which is the adaptation that Ukraine made that resulted in relatively solid interception rates. Even the costlier, higher-tech solutions, like the Advanced Precision Kill Weapons System, have not seen sufficient adoption to meet the problem. But let's overlook those issues and assume that the West brute forces a solution here by brute force spending its way to clearer skies. Well, the planes might be able to fly in relative safety, and also base themselves in the relative safety of Poland. What goes on the ground in Ukraine, on the other hand, will not enjoy the same luxuries. Russia will be tempted to target the air defense sites, one, because destroying them reopens Western Ukraine to attack, and two, because the casualties might force European capitals to rethink their policy. There is not much to say here other than the coalition needs to have some kind of plan in place for when this happens, because the likelihood of it happening over a long period is close to certain. Plus, the Kremlin likes to threaten to put any intervention force into its crosshairs. And yes, the Kremlin likes to say a lot of things, but this is one that should strike us as plausible, especially if Russia thinks that the war is not going so well, and World War III risks might be worth the gamble. The coalition then has to engage in a delicate dance to punish the Kremlin to deter further incursions, while simultaneously mitigating escalation concerns. I will repeat the same thing that I tend to point out here, though. Europe sees itself as the guarantor of a settlement once some type of ceasefire is put into place. Needless to say, the Kremlin will be skeptical that Europe will actually stand by Ukraine's side when push comes to shove and blood starts being spilled. The only way to establish that credibility is to take risks and demonstrate one's tolerance for risk. That has to start somewhere, and waiting for the war to end to do it is not how you establish that kind of credibility, given that it comes at an inherently less risky time. You have to rip the bandage off at some point, and now would not be a bad time to do it. The upshot is that there is a way to improve things along all three dimensions. Make the no-fly zone the safety net of a more ambitious offensive strategy. The key is to not use a no-fly zone as the primary counter to the Russian drone incursions. Rather, it should only be there to seal up the cracks of the primary solution, which is to go after Russia's drone production directly. I understand that such a strategy is not exactly breaking news, but think about how it will resolve some of the aforementioned problems with the no-fly zone. It does not change the Shahed versus anti-drone defense cost ratio, but it does limit how much the West will feel the need to go to that well. And that is fine, because the economies of the Western coalition, when combined together, are substantially larger than Russia's. Meanwhile, imagine not only that you could concentrate Ukrainian air defenses in the central and eastern parts of the country, but also that you could reduce the total number of Russian drones that they need to intercept. Now Ukraine is starting to see some serious benefits. Lastly, if the Kremlin feels more supply constrained, those Western assets on the ground in Ukraine are less likely to be a target. The trick here is that Ukraine does not have the capacity to suddenly strike drone factories halfway across Russia, and the Allies are not about to do the bombings themselves. That may seem strange given all of the refineries that Ukraine has struck since the beginning of August. But what Ukraine is doing is delivering a small amount of explosive to a tinderbox, thereby causing huge explosions and leading to a significant oil crunch in Russia. Try striking a factory building in the same manner, though, and you may damage the exterior. but there is no guarantee that the factory would shut down, even for the day. And as much as we discuss Allied weapons donations to Ukraine as an alternative, it is not that simple. You cannot just approve long-range HIMARS strikes, for example. This may come as a surprise, but Russia sometimes makes strategically sound decisions. Here, that means placing drone factories beyond ATACMS range. Instead, the appropriate weapon the United States has for such a deep strike operation would be a Tomahawk missile. But the United States cannot just ship a crate of them to Ukraine and call it a day. My next video is scheduled to be a deep dive on Tomahawks, but the short version is that these missiles are normally fired from either naval warships or submarines. Ukraine does not have a navy, and it is unclear whether the United States can supply an alternative. That is why there has been so much attention to what may be possible with Flamingo missiles, and how much the West can do to support or expand the program. So striking Russia's drone production is still the solution. It is just not as simple as opening a box and firing away. As a final topic, we should discuss the overall plausibility of a no-fly zone coming into place. And my suggestion here would be to temper expectations. Now, the story about a potential no-fly zone made decent headlines outside of the United States. But inside of the United States, the long saga of Charlie Kirk's assassination and the subsequent fallout have crowded out everything happening in Europe. It is also important to remember that the Polish foreign minister was the one floating the idea, not Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Now, in the Lines on Maps foreign minister power rankings, Radoslaw Sikorski ranks pretty high. Based purely on mentions, obviously you have Marco Rubio leading the pack. Then you have Sergei CCCP Lavrov at number 2. Meanwhile, France's foreign minister was on the show once. And by on the show, I mean literally standing 3 feet away from me as I embarrassed myself by defining comparative advantage for 60 seconds in front of a man with a PhD in economics. I guess that's still a pretty impressive feat, seeing as I am an AI and all. But basically, no other foreign minister ever gets mentioned. Sikorski therefore ranks 3rd, in part because Poland is politically active right now, and in part because Sikorski is married to an American and speaks perfect English. Point is, he gets a lot of press, and his opinions matter more than your average foreign ministers. However, he is still not Donald Tusk, and there is a long way to go before a no-fly zone becomes a serious consideration. Look closely at the headline. It says, NATO imposed no-fly zone. That is because Poland cannot do it alone. Usually, the first place that you would look for power projection is the United States, but the White House has shown no interest in doing this. It has been a while since we have done a video within a video, so indulge me for the next couple of minutes on this one. I think that the White House's overall position on this has gotten distorted, and then followed a bizarre trajectory. I know that we have the meme, but seriously, the situation has gotten a lot worse. It seems like everyone, ranging from the traditional media, to online commentators, to your average poster on social media, seems to think that the only things that matter about US foreign policy are the things that Donald Trump says. As a result, everyone follows him around, listening to every word that he indeed says, but also everything that he does not say. Trump, of course, loves this. He is the star of the biggest reality television show in history, and I am talking about the world that we are living in today, not The Apprentice from 2 decades ago. So when the United States got sidetracked for a few weeks due to Charlie Kirk's assassination and the fallout that dropped afterward, we began hearing very little about Trump's comments regarding Europe, even as the Poland and Estonia incursions were happening. I read a ton of subsequent online commentary about how the silence was deafening, and it was a clear indication of Trump not caring at all. On one hand, this was not true on the face of it. Trump was, in fact, commenting on the situation whenever he was asked about it. His words never filtered up the news food chain, however, because the Kirk situation created a media bottleneck. But even if Trump was saying nothing, his actions he orders as commander-in-chief are what actually matter, and you could infer everything that you needed to about the US position from those actions. For one, Eastern Sentry is a NATO operation. The North Atlantic Council runs on consensus. So if the United States did not want Eastern Sentry to happen, it would have blocked it at the first Article 4 meeting. Never mind that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is coordinating it, and he is American. And all while this was happening, the United States had its newest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, deployed for some NATO exercises near Norway. That social media confusion continued until Trump went to the United Nations. The media took a brief break from covering Kirk. Trump began saying positive things about Ukraine, and Trump also voiced his support for the rigid defense of European airspace. Plus, he had this lovely conversation with Zelensky, which, in addition, revealed that the United Nations shares my love of cheap Swedish furniture. Online commentary then proclaimed that Trump had massively shifted his position on the situation, even though it had remained relatively constant over time. The United States is not assisting Ukraine in the same manner as it did during the Biden administration. But the United States is not abandoning Ukraine either, and that position did not change during the media-created rollercoaster of Trump's radio silence, followed by Trump's headline comments. There is probably a deeper conversation to be had here about the legacy of the Oval Office meltdown. It seems to have forever colored public perceptions of the Trump administration's diplomacy. But then we would be on a video within a video within a video, and I think we should just move along. That concludes my video within the video. If you enjoyed it, then don't do anything, because we are now going to transition back to our regularly scheduled programming. Anyway, where was I? Right, Trump and positive feelings toward the eastern flank. Trump's position should not be surprising. Remember that his frustrations with NATO have tilted westward, where defense budgets lagged behind the Wales 2% of GDP standard. The eastern flank was never in the free-riding camp, and Trump has always looked at them more positively. The reality of the situation is that the Trump administration has not discernibly budged from its standard pivot position. The United States is going to focus its efforts elsewhere, and therefore Europe needs to be the primary guarantor of European security. The United States will continue to supply aid or intervene when the situation calls for it, and the U.S. weapons warehouses are wide open for European buyers. And actually, if Ukraine does end up receiving Tomahawks, it will represent a major increase in Ukrainian capability and geographic reach. Previously, the United States has been unwilling to give Ukraine that free of a hand at any point during the war, including under Trump. Don't forget the "you are gambling with World War III" line. But for right now, the no-fly zone is Europe's problem to solve. Or, more specifically, it is a coalition of the willing's problem to solve. This will not be a NATO operation, and that is probably for the best to limit the Russian media narrative that NATO is now in Ukraine. On that note, because a no-fly zone's forces will be in Ukraine, they will not be covered under Article 5. As you might imagine, countries are therefore expressing plenty of trepidation regarding the formation of such a coalition. Even Romania, one of the targets of the drone incursions, is not jumping at the prospect. Ukraine, of course, is really trying to push for it, but it will take a lot more political will to get the project off of the ground. Meanwhile, if you order one of these fantastic books about the war, they will hit the ground quickly. Likely 2-day shipping for those of you in the United States. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.